Hi. Um, hey, really glad people are here. We're going to be talking about making your first contributions and what those are like and why. My name is Riona MacNamara. I'm a technical writer and I'm a documentation advocate on Google's open source strategy team. I've worked, like 25 years in technical documentation, but I'm actually new to Beam and to all of that area. So, and I've also been working with Aizhamal on things. We recently did some user studies around what helps people contribute and onboard to documentation, on board with open source projects. So we're going to talk a little bit about that later on. So.
Thank you, Rina. And as you guessed, I'm the other person presenting, Aizhamal, and I am an open source manager, program manager, and I contribute to a couple of open source projects. One of them is Apache Beam, the other one is Apache Airflow. And yeah, I also advocate for more love for documentation and also for recognition of all sorts of non-code contributions. And because this talk is about how to become a contributor in open source project, like you and you're here because you're interested in becoming one of them, and that's awesome because any open source project, it's about communities and it's about it's people, and that's important for many, many reasons, because like we bring more people to the project is more active, and the more active is the project, the more is adoption, and it's virtuous cycle of all good things happening, right? And another thing, because more people are in the project, and if they come from very diverse backgrounds, like educational, age, like cultural, they're gonna bring a lot of new skills and perspective to the project. So the problems get solved with more creative approaches, and the problems are gonna get solved a lot faster. And yeah, it helps the project grow and become better. And I wanted to share like my story of how I started contributing back to an open source, and how I became a committer in one of them last month. And it's not Apache Beam, it's Apache Airflow, but the process is the same everywhere. So anyway, so first, I'm not a developer. I studied economics, I worked in banking industry, then I did marketing, and I didn't know anything about contributing to open source, and I used it a lot, like, you know, the Linux and Android, and I had my GitHub website like 6 years ago, and I didn't know that it wasn't like open source, so I didn't understand what it was, right? And I started contributing back only when I joined my current team, and yeah, and that's how I started. So when you look at this picture, what makes you feel
Scared?
Yeah, I mean, it's unstable bridge. You need some support, and you're heading somewhere, probably somewhere nice. But yeah, that's me and my journey of being newbie and becoming the project maintainer at the end. But yeah, it was really scary. It was really scary. I mean, I think it's scary for everyone. It's scary for very experienced engineers, but for non-engineers, I think it's even scarier. So in the beginning, I would take like at least 3 days to send one email because I had to polish every time, like I was never satisfied with it, and I was scared that everyone would call me like, oh, what is this stupid idea that you're suggesting us? But anyway, so what do you think I did there? When we think of open source contribution, we mostly think about its code, and it's critical. It's one of the core parts of any technology. But as I mentioned earlier, I'm not a developer, so I must have done something else, right? And so what did I do? I started by housekeeping. I worked a lot with Jira issues. The Apache Airflow Jira was really, I mean, it's still a mess, but it's a lot better, I think. But yeah, I started revamping it. I reorganized the components, and there were like too many or too specific or too broad, and no one would use them, and no one would use the labels properly. And I mean, still we are going there. We are learning how to put, like, how to make the users who file issues to put everything in proper components with proper labels, because it helps with Jira triage. So the ones that didn't have all of those, I started adding them, and there were like 1,200 issues that needed attention. So I started working on them, and there are like 400 issues left now. I also did the Season of Dogs management for them. If you don't know about it, it's like Google Summer of Code, but for documentation. And this year, Google started the first round of this program, and yeah, the Apache Airflow got selected to the program, and now I think the application period ended, and we're gonna get technical writer to improve the documentation of Apache Airflow, and it's great. And also, Apache Airflow website is far from being friendly for any users or contributors, so I suggested to revamp it and make it better, and the proposal got accepted, and the community was really grateful for all the work that I was doing, and the PMC members were really happy about my work, and like, apart from saying thank you many times, at the end they actually invited me for committership, and I accepted, and I'm really happy about it. But there's so many other things that anyone can do, like with your skills, right? I mean, you might be really good at organizing meetups, like Matthias, or yes, and but if you have like some design, I don't know, if you know some tools, design tools, then maybe you can actually design logos for events or for the website, and that's very valuable, because I think open source projects, they need a lot of improvement on that side. And if you're like website developer, like, you can help us, craft what should be the open source website requirements, right? What pages it should have, and like create templates. And if you're a technical writer, like, you can, there's so many things to do with any open source project's documentation, and there are a lot of things that anyone can do. And today, actually, we want to deep dive into one of them that is not about, it's about not.
It's not code.
Yes.
It's a non-code contribution.
Exactly. And let's talk about one type of non-code contribution.
Thank you. Okay. So, 93%. That's a really high number. But according to the open source survey in 2017, this is the number of respondents who said that outdated or incomplete documentation is a problem that is impacting their productivity and their use of the project. That's 93%. And sometimes it seems that even in proprietary or open source software, documentation is everybody's problem, but it is nobody's job. And that's a real problem, because all kinds of software is such a deeply complex and highly collaborative endeavor. The documentation is a critical part of handling that complexity. Yet even now, we often see it's absolutely important for things like awareness, product adoption, development velocity, code quality, the reliability of services running in production. But it's also really, really critical in the open source world to community. Because at Google, a while ago, at the beginning of this year, we wanted to understand what the factors were in getting people to become users and progress towards becoming contributors to a project. And because the fact is that while open source is used the world over, the contributor base looks nothing like the user base, and that's a challenge for everybody, right? Because we are missing out on the talents of an awful lot of people if we don't use it. So we commissioned a study, and that looked at the information needs of people at every stage of their journey, from when they're assessing a project to when they're adopting and using it, and then when they're contributing back to it or not. And what became really, really clear is that documentation is absolutely critical at every stage of the journey. Without clear, accessible documentation and knowledge, they can drop out at any stage. They may never adopt it, they may adopt it and not use it, and they may just never make that leap to contribution. And yet we're still in a world where we see things like this. This is something that came up on Quora, where I was looking, where some person trying to use open source says, how do I understand it? Well, you can go back and read some books and work on your own projects for a couple of years, just like you might the guitar. Somebody else recommended you should go back and read the code commit by commit, which is ideal if you're living a life of leisure, or perhaps your employer is doing that. But it is advice completely impractical for anybody who is using code, for like their job, because who has the time for that? An awful lot of people don't have the time, because the truth is leisure time is a really scarce resource, and it is not a resource that is evenly distributed. This is some figures that show, for example, the amount of unpaid labor that women do every single day compared to men. The UN's figure is women do 2.6 times the amount of work. So if you're in a culture where you say you need to have the leisure time to dig into your documentation, dig into the code in order to learn how to use open source, that lack of documentation is an incredibly powerful barrier against contribution. We just need to acknowledge that this is a privilege that is not existent to anyone. Another example where documentation is really critical is that we may say, okay, there's no documentation, but reach out to somebody and ask them a question. But that kind of ignores the fact that not everybody experiences the internet in the same way. For example, women are far more likely than men to encounter unwelcome language or content that makes them feel unwelcome, and even harassment. And the same goes for some other underrepresented minorities. And as a result, unsurprisingly, women and underrepresented minorities are much less likely to reach out and ask for help in this situation. So in this situation, lack of documentation is an incredibly effective barrier against participation. Another one is that nearly a quarter of the open source community speaks or reads English less than very well. That makes it really challenging to reach out to people. It makes it really challenging to deal with online communities when you're not fluent in the language, when it's a challenge. And in that case, documentation can support them and support that journey. Not everyone's got the same level of expertise. Not everyone knows the product as well as you do. Not everybody is a developer. If there is not documentation that provides an on-ramp for people who are more beginners or less solid in their skill set, there we have a really effective barrier to contribution. So in this UX study that we did, it became really clear that documentation is one of the most critical ways that we can support our communities from every step of their journey through assessing a project, because the very presence of well-organized documentation was reported as being a really strong signal of project health. People need to know that they will be supported in doing this before they ever adopt it. And certainly before they make the leap to contribution, they need to be able to understand these things. So this is one of the areas where I am making a pitch for documentation as early contributions, because we talked about the levels of expertise, and there is something that new contributors bring to the game. This is the concept of Shoshone, which is a Zen concept, but in the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. In the experts, there are few. And you could say that that is analogous to this idea of API blindness and things. We become so familiar with something, we don't even see the blind spots. So people who are new to a project, people who are not experts, people who don't have that pre-built-in knowledge, are in a position to bring something to the project that is lacking. And that the repercussions of that and the benefits of that can be really, really huge. So how do you get started? There are all kinds of contributions. One of the things I want to say, like I said before, I've been a technical writer for about 25 years, and I'm going to say something that technical writers don't like to hear, and this is, you do not need to be a writer to create documentation, and I'm going to tell you another thing, it is not rocket science. Sometimes I do hear, I worked for a long time in internal engineering documentation at Google, and I would hear that a barrier to engineers creating documentation is, I'm not a writer. You don't need to be a writer. If you want to polish sentences until they are beautiful and shining, you should go and write haiku. It is not the necessary. For in engineering documentation, if you can explain something to a colleague, you can write functional, good documentation. It's not about beautiful writing, it is about making sure that the information exists and is clearly conveyed. Everything else you do is gravy on the cake. That's all that matters. The other thing is you don't need to be perfect, and neither do the docs. I think we often have a tendency, with code, with anything else, to hold back until everything is perfect, or you think that they can be improved. Don't hold information from the community. We have a thing at work at Google where we say better trumps best. It's just small incremental improvements. It's better to get that information out there. It will be improved later on. What's important is that it exists and it's clearly conveyed. So if you're a writer, that's something to bear in mind. If you're a reviewer, say if one of the ways that you're contributing to the project is by reviewing PRs, and it's documentation PR, try not to nitpick too much. It's better to have it out there. Don't expect amazing writing or even really good writing. Just look for the information, can it be understood? And don't expect verbosity or long paragraphs. Bullet points, paragraphs are great. All we really need to do is to hold documentation to the lowest reasonable standard. Documentation doesn't have to be perfect, it just needs to be good enough. It's far better to get something out there and let other people improve it. So some kind of ideas or principles around getting started and doing it is, if you're going to be contributing code, update the docs at the same time, because there's one truth in life, which is that code evolves and docs decay. And that's really bad, right? Because out of date or inaccurate documentation is probably worse than no documentation. And it needn't be a big hassle if you update the code to update the docs at the same time. It's really just about saving the important information you have in your head in a more permanent medium so others can get it later without asking yourself. And so, quite often this can be super lightweight. Documentation for a PR can just be something like pasting in a command that you used over and over to test your changes. If you did that, paste it and add it to the docs with an explanation of what it's for. You might need to add a box to an existing diagram or delete something that already exists there. Again, there's lots of ways of contributing around the documentation thing. If you're writing docs, think about that. If you're reviewing a PR and it's a code PR, consider asking for a doc change. Does this PR need to have a doc change? And a good rule of thumb for that is an awful lot of changes don't need doc changes. This is not about putting an extra burden on you. A good rule of thumb is that if a change doesn't require tests, it probably doesn't require docs either. But if somebody needs to change their behavior as a result of this change, update the docs, and it may simply be a word here, change the name of a variable. It may not be hard, but doing so is a powerful force for good in supporting users. That's if it doesn't. Another kind of way of contributing, which is kind of counterintuitive, is to delete stuff. Delete stuff that is out of date, delete a paragraph that no longer applies, delete a document that is no longer valid. People are afraid to delete it, but we have source control. You can always get it back if something goes wrong. And misleading docs and out-of-date docs are far more harmful than missing docs, to be honest. So deleting stuff is as valid a contribution as creating it. So how do you start? Just start small. If you want to improve the documentation, which is a noble mission that is critical to all of these things, to development velocity and code quality and community, no change is too small. This is one from Leah, a colleague of this, and she pointed out that she made this one-line doc change. And this is that she had spent a long time figuring out what the default value is for this variable. She made a one-line change that stated what that is. Tiny change. It saved all this time for thousands of users, probably. No change is too small. Documentation is something that the impact can be far beyond the effort. So, hope you'll consider that for as you begin contributing. Aizhamal?
Yeah, and when you start, like if you have any questions, particularly about Beam, just reach out to people in the community. And like Beam community is really nice and kind. And yeah, there's like if you have questions about the code, there's Pablo, there's Robert, there's they're here today, and you can ask them directly. And there's also if you have any project like questions about documentation of Apache Beam, you should talk to Melissa. If you have Jira questions, talk to Ken. He does all the Jira of Beam. And yeah, if you want to host your meetup, talk to Matthias. He does it all the time, everywhere. And yeah, and if you have general questions about documentation, Riona is a perfect candidate. And yeah, we always read the dev list of Apache Beam, so always send out the questions. And there's also a Slack channel that you can join, and I provide the links in the speaker notes, so I'm going to be sharing the presentations later. And yeah, and if you thought of something that you could add to the project, just share. Don't wait until it's perfect, polished, as Riona said about docs. It doesn't have to be perfect about anything else. So when you share it, people gonna make suggestions and you're gonna improve your idea. And you can do it in the mailing list, or you can do it in Slack channel, or you can just do it like if it's the question even or answer, just go to Stack Overflow and put your contributions there. And yeah, and grow and make an impact in the community. And yeah, that's it. And also, if the research that we did at Google, and we gave a talk 2 days ago at Berlin Buzzwords, and that talk is going to be linked in these presentations too. And if you're curious, we're going to provide the whole research as well. And yeah, thank you.